all systems are broken. What does that mean? Well, the starting point of this particular exploration is, what is a system broken out of? What is a system breaking that leads to this perspective, this statement? And the beginning of all things is the one. In the scientific narrative, a little bit of energy, about this big, suddenly, poof. And 24 billion years later, this little circle the size of a pea is everything that has ever been and everything that is in the known universe. It begins with a circle. Now, in mythological terms, we begin with the garden. We begin with the one. We begin with the ecology. And we descend out of the garden, out of the one, the unity with God, Goddess, all that is. We descend into the knowledge, the language, the knowledge, the language of good and evil. And the knowledge of good and evil, which begins with the one, takes the circle and divides it into two parts. We now have a system. We have part A and we have part B. Together, they make up the one. Separate, they are two parts of what? A system. The most basic system that there is a polarizing system, is a polarity, is a duality, is a cut between A and B. And the question is, what is this cut made of? What is it that takes half of all that is and lumps it over here, and takes the other half of all that is and lumps it over there? And I would suggest that you cannot cut reality in two without language, because you cannot think a thought without language. There's absolutely nothing that you can think and thus be humanly conscious of without the use of language. So what cuts the world in two is the gnosis, the knowledge of polarity, referenced mythologically in our myths as the knowledge of good and evil. But in more ancient cultures, it's the knowledge of yin and yang, the knowledge of opposites. Now, all of the magic in life occurs in the synergy that is the space between opposites. So if we think of the generation or the refraction of 256 million colors, which is the maximum number of colors that most computer chips can refract the one, the infinite spectrum of color, into 256 million bits. If we think of that, that's the children of black and white. You start off with black and white, you run a prism between that polarity and you get the rainbow. You get the third energy. And the third energy, the synergy, is always greater than its constituent components. So the birthplace of the infinite continuums of time, of space, of color, of intensity. All of the continuums that exist between two extremes. The infinite continuum of temperature exists between the archetypal poles of hot and cold, where you imagine that there's an infinite amount of heat and an infinite amount of cold, and then the spectrum, the continuum of temperature, which we break down by degrees. But why not half a degree? Why not 1/millionth of a millionth of a millionth of a millionth of a degree? Why not a billionth of a trillionth of a degree? It's an infinite continuum. It just depends on where we place the marks. On any system, on any continuum, we decide on a spacing of the mark, of the degree, of the inch, of the meter. And we use that to measure an infinite continuum. The infinite continuum is born between polarity. But what is the knowledge of good and evil? What is the system broken out of? It's broken out of the circle. A system is a broken circle. And the reason that all systems are broken, that all systems are flawed, is first of all, to create a system is to break the undifferentiated whole, is to break the unity of ecology. Because before there is a system, all people, all things, all time, all space, all of existence is one complete, infinite ecology. It is the unconscious feminine, the One. And the One exists for all time and space endlessly until we cut the One into two. And we do it with language, up and down, good and bad, good and evil, hot and cold. Every pole that we create on the circle is a cut in the paradigm of polarity, which is the paradigm of extinction, of distinction, which is what words are. What words do is they take this whole that we're seeing here, that is unconscious, and we turn it into lots of bits that become conscious through words. So if we just say this, there's no words. But if we say that's one finger and that's two fingers, that's one pinky and that's another pinky, now we're aware of two pinkies existing because we just invented them by slicing the hand up into fingers through language. And we just invented a hand by slicing a hand up from a body with language. And we just invented a body by pretending that the body is separate from the space around the body, which of course is irrational. Because if there was no space, there could be no body. So how can you make a rational case that the body is separate from the space it depends upon to exist? You can say that that's the air and this is the body. But if the body needs the air and engages with the air, is in an interdependent relationship with the air, then how do you pretend that the body is truly separate from that which it depends on to exist? Now, if you took the motor out of a car and said that the car was independent of the motor, we'd think you'd gone a little bit nuts. If the car requires the motor in order to move, then the motor is part of the car. If the body requires the oxygen in order to move, then the oxygen is part of the body. But what body are we talking about? Because we've just broken up the body by shape. We haven't broken up the body based on relationships. If we break the body up based on relationships, then suddenly the human ego, constructed out of language, dissolves into a much larger organism. Because if the body cannot exist without its fuel, and the fuel is part of the body, and the fuel cannot exist without the forest, and so the forest is part of the fuel, and the forest cannot exist without gravity, and so gravity is part of the forest. And gravity connects the entire universe as an underlying principle. You start to see the reality of the interconnection of all things, of all time. That the equation that you actually unravel is one of a giant entity, a giant ecology, in which every single part of the ecology has a direct or indirect relay, a relationship, on multiple dimensions. Now, if what you're seeing here, the color of my skin, is in rapport to the sun. You see, I've been out in the sun recently. And so the color of my skin is more brown because from however many hundreds of thousands of miles away, the light, the energy from a sun has changed the color of my skin. It's also given birth to the trees that are keeping me alive every day. So can I truly pretend that I am separate from the sun and from sunlight? If who I am is defined in part by sun and sunlight, it's a weak, rational case. So the most rational person that exists would do the math and follow the various equations and present the evidence that all things are connected. They're in a relationship, and what that's called is an interdependent ecology. That's what reality is, an interdependent ecology. Now, if we call it a series of isolated boxes or pizza slices, because that's how we sliced the ecology up in our mind. See, because we have not cut the earth in half. We have not cut the universe in half. We have cut our minds in half. And we've cut our minds in half with language. The interconnected ecology of all that ever is, was, and will be. Anyone following the time continuum can notice connections between what's happening now and what's happening in the future and what's happening in the past. You see, for my finger to go from here over to here, it's starting here, this is the past, it had to get here. It started here, which means there's a connection from the past to the present. But the present is also setting up the future. So there's a connection from the present to the future. And because of imagination, where we think about the future we could have and the future we want to have, and then we make different decisions based on what we desire, there's then a relationship between the future and the present. Because if I say, you know what, I don't want to be fat, and if I eat this, I'm going to be fat when? In the future. So I'm not going to eat this. You see, there's a relationship between the future and the present. And if I look at my body and I am fat, and the reason I'm fat is I ate too many sugars and carbohydrates and dairy without enough exercise, then there's a relationship between what's going on right here and the past. Now, the past obviously influences the present, but the present also changes the past. Because if I say in the present, let's think about all the happy things, well, then the past reveals the happy things and the past becomes more happy. If I say in the present, let's look at the miserable things in the past, then the past reveals the miserable things and the past becomes more miserable. So there's a relay between the present and the past and the future and the present. There's a connection between the past and the future via the present. So time is interconnected. Space is interconnected. Could you imagine an ocean current traveling around the continents if the world was actually cut in half? How about the gravitational pull? What would you, if we actually took a knife and cut the world in half and said this is the northern hemisphere and this is the southern hemisphere? See, we've just cut it in half in our mind. We haven't actually cut anything. We've just created the illusion of distinction, and we've created that illusion through language, and we're sticking to it. You know, we're not budging. That's the way it is because that's the way it is. First there was God, and then there was the Word. First there is the Creator, and then there is the power that we each have to cut creation up, to cut the whole into as many pieces as possible, as many pieces as we want. And in doing so, we create a divided mind. We create schizophrenia. We create diversity. We create a pantheon of personas that exist within each one of us. As this part of us in this time is saying this, and this part of us in that time is saying this, and our 3-year-old is saying, I want some ice cream, and our 20-year-old is saying, stay thin, and our 30-year-old is saying, well, maybe thin is overrated. Let's give the 3-year-old some ice cream. And all of these different parts exist, are manufactured in the illusion that is language. Because just because we cut the world up in 1,000 different ways does not mean that the cuts that we think we're making in our mind are actually real. The universe is not, in fact, divided in half, with half of it being good and half of it being evil. Now, a scientist can explain this because the way reality is constructed as an interdependent ecology is such that it does not make sense. It does not make sense to pretend that polarity exists when one pole cannot exist without the other. Think about the hero and the villain. So, in order for a hero to rescue a victim from a villain, so we have three roles here, the hero requires the villain to do something to the victim. The victim requires the villain to do something to them, or they cannot be a victim. And then the hero must intervene to rescue the victim from the villain. No villain, no hero. No victim, no hero. Now, if there's no victim, there's no villain. You can't have a villain without a victim. You can't have a victim without a villain. You can't have a hero without both a victim and a villain. So you've taken the circle, the infinite one, you've divided it, in this case, into a triangle with language. And here we have the victim, the villain, and the hero. They are interdependent, mathematically speaking. It's the same with a speaker and a listener, which is taking the circle and dividing it into two. If nobody is listening, not even the ears of the speaker, there is no speech. Speech is that which is heard. If no one is speaking, there is no listening. Listening is that which is spoken. So you cannot have a listener without a speaker, and you cannot have a speaker without a listener. You certainly cannot have communication without a speaker and a listener. So are they really that interconnected? Are they truly that separate? This is the speaker completely different from the listener? How can they be if one cannot exist without the other? The person and the air, are they really so separate? How can they be when the person changes the air and the air gives life to the person? So reality is all about the interconnected whole. It is about the sphere, the uninterrupted, transcendent ecology of one. And the mind is all about perceiving the one through an infinite number of parts called words. Now, once you cut up the whole in a grid of words, and there have been 10,000 cults in human history, each with their own language, which means that everyone cuts the world apart, cuts the world up, cuts reality up in a different order. Some cut the world up. For example, Eskimos cut snow into 400 different slices. Now, to people that just watch snow on Christmas, Santa Claus, reindeer, maybe they live in the Philippines, they never see snow. Snow is enough. Just to say that's that white stuff that's a different color from that other stuff, and it's cold, so that's snow. So they cut the world into snow. But an Eskimo needs to know if it's the kind of snow that is sleet melting towards glacier fall, or is water hardening towards ice? Because those two distinctions determine whether or not they can make it from one location to the other within 4 hours, which is the maximum amount of time they can be in sub-zero temperatures with the given clothing and food that they have and the energy of their dogs. So they need to know that distinction to survive. And so they cut snow 400 different ways. But it is still a broken system, because what a word is breaking is the uninterrupted ecology. And whether it breaks snow into one word, as distinguished from fire or some other thing, or whether it breaks it into 4,000 words. Because certainly, if you watch snow under a microscope, you can identify 4,000 different states of snow. The trouble is we run out of RAM. So you can invent a billion, 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 billion words. You can name every electron in the multiverse. It's just you will be dead so many times before you get around to naming even all the electrons in your own body, let alone all the electrons in the planet, that we don't bother to cut reality into such fine little squares. But we could, and it would be just as much an illusion in reality and truth as would saying this is snow and this is fire. So a system is broken out of the sphere. A system is a rendition, a heuristic model of the sphere. And the number of points on the system determine the resolution of the system. Is it a 10-point system? Is it a 5-point system? That is determined by the number of points the one is refracted into. You can break a system out of the circle as a 10-point system, a 20-point system, a billion-point system. Now, a human mind is going to break the one into a system that it is capable of relating to. Now, if I give you a 20-digit number, most of you are not going to remember it. 20, 49, 60, 80, 28, 32, 287, 92, 7, 0, 1, 295, 2, 0, 3. Most people cannot accurately replay that number. Now, that's not personal. That's talking about the current development of human consciousness, the current development of the human brain, which is the tool we are using to refract reality into bits called words. So we create simple systems, simple models of cutting the universe into bits, because our brains have a hard time remembering 200 trillion and counting systems of relating to reality. But 200 trillion is a very, very tiny number when we think of all of the subatomic particles on our planet alone. And then think of all the subatomic particles on all the planets in our solar system, and then all solar systems in our universe. Well, it's a very, very, very tiny number, 200 trillion, but it's too big for the human brain. And so we cut the world into bits to be aware of it, but we do so rather crudely. East, west, north, south. Why don't we have 30 different directions. Just why haven't we all memorized 30 different directions so that when we're saying go so-and-so, we have 30 words for it? East, west. See, we start saying southeast because we can't remember another word, so we combine south and east. That's a pretty weak memory. And reality is far more complex than we are aware of because our awareness comes through language. So every system, first of all, is an illusion because everything is an interconnected whole. Every system is an illusion created with language. And it is broken out of the circle. The system is broken out of the circle. And it is a useful system if it allows us to see and understand more of the circle than we would without language. And since we're human consciousness looking from an isolated human ego through language back at the reality we are a part of, anything that we can see through language about the underlying ecology that we're a part of and ourself helps us to navigate. It's very much because what we're dealing with is heuristic models of reality created by language that do not, in fact, exist except in the human mind, where the models reside, hosted on language and memory. So that's how our world exists. Now, you can break the sphere into a system. The distinctions of the system are, one, symmetry. How symmetrical is the system? This is supposed to be symmetrical. It's not, of course, because it's hand-drawn, but it's supposed to be symmetrical, right? And we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So 1 is how symmetrical the distinctions are. And the more symmetrical a system is, the sphere is the most graceful shape, and that's why we have wheels for cars. If we drive on symmetrical shapes, and the circle and sphere being the most symmetrical, we will have a more graceful journey. And so how symmetrical it is. Now this ties in with distinctions. How many distinctions? Because the more distinctions there are, the more symmetrical it is. Because right now, these points in a simple system, these points, are not the same circumference as the midpoints. So you have a loss of symmetry. But if we were to have a 300-point system, it would look a lot more symmetrical. The distance between the rim and the center would average out the more complex the system. So you move towards grace as you move towards symmetry, and you move towards symmetry and grace as you move towards complexity. So distinction/complexity is the next variable. And that, of course, ties in with balance. Are you centered and balanced in the middle? If you are at the center of your system, you have more grace than if you are in an extreme thing, which is why the wheel is mounted in the center. If it's mounted on the side, you have a very bumpy ride. And so systems that leave you in the center, systems are more complex, systems that are more symmetrical. So what we're actually doing is we start with the knowledge of good and evil, which is we take the one and we cut it in half. And then we develop, as we evolve, we become more sophisticated. The old-time fear-based religions were all about saying, we're the good people, right? obviously. Every cult in human history has told its people that they're the good people. There have been 10,000 cults in human history. They were all the good people. Every single one of them was good people, and that's us. So whatever we are, that's good. That's a given. But in dualistic system, the other, whoever we are not, is, wait for it, bad. They're bad people. Now, we learn in simple modules of religion and stuff, we're the good people, we believe in the true God, the real God, the only God. And of course, there have been 10,000 gods in human history, if not more, because many cults have created hundreds of deities and don't try to kind of unify them all into one. So there's been hundreds of thousands of deities in the cultures and cults of our history. And of course, every religion is the only right one. There have been 10,000 religions all claiming to be the right one, and they still do. Like the Christians, that's the right religion. The Buddhists, they're the right religion. They're all the right religion. Every religion in the history of humanity has been the right religion, and everything on the other side is bad. Now, this works when you're in isolated villages and you don't know anything else. But when you travel and you realize there are nice, kind people who helped you, the bad people helped you. They helped you off your luggage. They loaned you some money when you lost your wallet. Bad people helped me, the good people, stay alive. So we start discounting the simplistic models of duality. There are good people and bad people, and we develop what? More sophisticated models. We say there are people, and some people are good some of the time, and some people are bad some of the time, and people who are under a lot of stress tend to be more bad. People who are, have everything go their own way tend to be more nice. And so we start creating relational models. And then we start thinking about these models. We say, well, I see. So do you mean to say that most of the young children put to death in the United States were sodomized by an older man? Meaning they did a study one year of the young men who were not adults, who had committed crimes in the cult, and they were being executed. These young boys were being put to death by their cult for crimes against the cult. And it turned out that most of the boys on death row had been repeatedly sexually abused by an older man. Now, if you're ready for a little bit more sophistication, then there are good people and there are bad people. Moving on to, there are people who sometimes are good and sometimes are bad, to a little bit more ecological of a model, which says that when people are very cruel to children, those children tend to grow up to be more cruel, or at least a percentage of them do, to other people. And that when you do not traumatize a child and give them PTSD and treat them that the world is unsafe, that they tend to be nicer as grown-ups. Well, see, we're following the ecology path, right? Now we could say, so you mean to say that these young boys were told by their church that they would go to hell and burn in eternity for having sex with another man, another boy? Yeah, they were. Okay. And you mean to tell me that their priest, their Catholic priest, sodomized these boys after telling them that they would burn alive in hell for eternity if they had sex with someone of their own gender. Yeah. And you mean to say that when these boys came forward and tried to tell that their priest had sexually abused them, their parents believed the priest and asked the priest what they should do rather than protect their children? Yeah, that's right. And do you mean to say that those boys didn't know what to do with a cult that was that sociopathic, that believed in an all-powerful male who would torture them for eternity, and then their priest, the representative of that all-powerful male, set them up to be tortured for eternity by fucking them and then lying after saying the commandment was thou shalt not lie, and then that their own parents were more worried about what the priest thought of them than they were about their own children? And you mean to say that those boys were angry, confused, hurt, and hostile, and went and caused hurt and shared some of what they were given, some of the craziness, some of the terror, some of the rage, some of the helplessness? You mean to say that they gave some of that abuse back to their cult? Yeah. And for the crime of giving back what they were given by their priest and by God, they were put to death as children by their cult. Yeah. So who's the good guy and who's the bad guy? And of course, we wouldn't say who's the good girl and who's the bad girl because we're chauvinists. And so, guy means both because we all know that men in a chauvinistic cult are more important than the people who gave birth to them. You mean to say that you are more important than your mother, without whom you wouldn't exist? Yeah. And how do you figure that? So let's delete your mother, because she's not important, before she gives birth to you, right? Because you don't need women, right? It doesn't work, does it? But cults are full of it. Cults are full of utter nonsense. And they always have been. They always have been. They always will be full of utter nonsense. That's what makes them a cult. The root word for culture is cult, because they're not sane. They're not kind. They're not sane. They're not intelligent. They're not scientific. They are completely and utterly crazy. Always have been, are, and always will. But the cult uses language to separate us from the cycles of energy that are all around us. So the sophistication of the model determines how graceful our reality is. How much we can embrace both sides also determines how much well-being we experience. Meaning, if we're dogmatic and we believe that more is always better, for example, there's less and then there's more. Well, you have some salt and you have a little more. You have some ice cream, you have a little more until you die. All extremes are toxic. Too little time, not enough time. Too much water, drowning. Not enough water, dehydration. Too much salt, not any salt. Too hot, 5,000 degrees. Too cold, 700 degrees below zero. It's too cold, it's too hot. All extremes are toxic, including toxic, perfect priests who fuck young boys after telling them they'll go to hell for being fucked. Pretty fucked up. It doesn't get more fucked up than that. Having a fucked up God tell a fucked up priest to fuck you and then punish you for all eternity. And we've done that in our cult, and we've covered it up at the expense of our boys and the people they harmed to somehow backlash at the cruelty and stupidity directed towards them from their religion, from their community leaders, their family, and their culture as a whole. So all systems are broken. They're broken out of the one, and as such, there is a certain amount of suffering. Now, you can see the suffering in this diagram here. Because imagine you're driving along in a train. It's a pretty smooth ride, right? Because the wheel is round, because it was carefully milled out of steel. But now, imagine you're in the train, but you're driving this. Now, this is a pretty good representation of a cult in that it's being generous. You see, cults are never symmetrical. They always overemphasize something and underemphasize others. Right now, it's an overemphasis of masculine energy, which both men and women have agreed that masculine energy is more valuable than feminine energy. That we would never have a Toastmasters teach effective public listening because that's feminine. We'll teach effective public speaking because that's masculine. Now, men and women can attend. We're not so archaic that we would say that women who want to be more masculine shouldn't be given equal opportunity to advance their masculinity and gain rank in a chauvinistic cult. But in a country that everyone talks in and nobody listens, wouldn't it be more intelligent to teach effective public listening rather than effective public speaking? But then we wouldn't be America, where everyone talks and nobody listens. But we're proud of that, as all cults are, because that's our identity. That's our pattern. That's how you can spot that we're America. We talk and we don't listen. We tell the world and we don't listen to the world. We tell ourselves and we don't listen to ourselves. We tell each other and we don't listen to each other. So we are the chauvinists, the ones who talk and don't listen, the ones who will take courses on how to talk better, but would never think of taking a course on how to listen better. Because who wants to listen when we've all agreed that feminine energy is less valuable than masculine energy? And so we have our asymmetrical cult, really our way asymmetrical cult. Now, imagine driving a train on this wheel. Flat part is fine, lifts up, lifts up, lifts up, and then bang, down onto the next angle. And so what a system does is it takes the graceful whole, divides it into parts, and then at every transit point from one point to the other point, there's a bang, there's a hard knock, there's a jolt, and that's called suffering. That's called dis-ease. The simpler the system, the more dis-ease. Obviously, if we went around, if we cut the circle into half, that's a pretty big jolt. You're way up on this tip here on the train and then collapse, you 30 tons down on this flat part, that you're not getting up there. There's no locomotive going to get this wheel back to turning again. You're stuck because your system was too simple. It was too rigid. It was too dogmatic. So you're stuck. But you might get by on a system like that. It's clackety, noisy, uncomfortable, but you can get a locomotive to turn that. But it grates on you. All systems create chronic, unnecessary suffering. All systems. The more refined the system, the more balanced the system, the more complex the system, the less suffering. Because we're moving closer and closer back to the sphere. Because the sphere is the undifferentiated and uninterrupted whole. And so the journey into human consciousness, which is a system of suffering, is the journey from the uninterrupted whole to the violent cutting of the earth and the cataclysm of consciousness that is black and white. And then we divide it a little bit more complexly into three. Now, this is a violent wheel to drive on. But we love threes, the heart, mind, and body. They're an interconnected circle. There are millions of points on the continuum of heart, mind, and body. We just are too lazy to delineate them and to think about them. And so we're always trying to figure out this three-part system. It's a difficult system to navigate. So we then replace the three-part system with a six-point system. It's getting a little bit more graceful, a little bit more complex, a little bit more conscious. So as each new system comes on board, it gets more complex, more conscious, more graceful, until as the din slowly wears down, as you get more and more points, more and more complexity, more and more symmetry and skill with the system. But every system is broken out of the whole. Now, having broken a system out of the feminine, out of the undifferentiated whole, you can then break the system that is broken out of the whole. Now, this occurs when you do something like that. You don't maintain the system. You get asymmetrical. You drift off on one side. The cult starts rewarding computer programming all of a sudden. So now everyone wants to be a computer programmer. So they all run over here, right? No one's tending to the ecology. Nobody's raising the children competently. Oh, well, we'll all be over here. And so anytime you have this high volatility with everyone racing around, now we all want to be gold diggers. Now we all want to be protesters. Now we all want to be cool like this. Every time you have these huge movements of migration and change, you get lots of volatility. Whenever you cut the world into half and everyone's trying to be on the good half, you're going to get unbalanced. And just like a boat, when everyone and all the cargo is put on the boat, if you get too imbalanced, too extreme on any side, you capsize. But if you stay centered in balance, see, this is why Buddhist or Chinese type yin-yang philosophy triumphs over Western, because Western cults break the world into good and bad, good and evil. Of course, we're the good ones, obviously, and they're the bad ones. And if there's some sense of integrity and intelligence with this, then we have to come up with a theory, like, why are we better than this? So we say something like freedom. We need more freedom, more freedom, more freedom, more freedom, more freedom. And so we have to have more freedom, right? It's obvious, right? And so then we wonder why the US has more people dying per capita of coronavirus than many third world countries. Well, sometimes freedom is not good. Or bigger is better. Working hard is good. So Americans work harder than everyone else. Of course, they can't manage to pay paid maternity leave or paternity leave like other countries, but who cares? They're working really hard. Anytime you pick an extreme and then try to be really good at that extreme, you become an extremist. And anytime you lean too hard in any extreme, you capsize your life, your culture, your body. Try and intake air more than you exhale. You will get sick. Try and drink more than you piss. Shut up the penis, keep drinking. You'll get sick. You've got to have a balance of in and out, of right and left, up and down, hot and cold, work and play. You have to have a balance. Now, the Buddhists, and all those working with yin-yang, don't pretend that there's the good and the bad and we're the good and everything else is bad. They say there's the middle way. Now, that's a more successful ideology. It's a more sophisticated because it creates three rather than two. We're going from a binary system of good-bad to two opposites and the middle way. It's more structurally sound. So you have an innately, structurally more competent ideology. It's still an ideology, and so it's still broken out of the one if it's in language, but it's moving towards the center. And that's why it's tied in with martial arts, because the body will teach you the center. Why? Because in martial arts, if you cannot find your center, you will be thrown by smaller, weaker opponents who know where their center is. So if you work closely with reality, your own body, it will teach you intelligence. It will teach you truth. If you work closely with your cult and ignore your body, particularly head-based cults are good at that, Western cults, you can be way over here ready to tip over and your cult will be saying, way to go, way to go. Oh my goodness, right? In Western cults, postgraduate degrees, they're the most unhappy, fucked up people in the cult. The more PhDs and postgraduate degrees a person has, the more likely they are to be unhappy. Because knowledge is good, so more knowledge is better, so more knowledge. So you should spend your whole life avoiding life so that you can study and prepare for life. You take that to an extreme, you get someone getting their third degree at age 35 who still doesn't know what life is, and everyone's clapping at how many degrees they have because they're in a fucked up cult that doesn't understand the counterpoint to preparing for life is actually living life. And they've thrown most of it away because their cult lied to them, and they've paid for it. Hundreds of thousands of dollars. You paid to be thrown off and lied to by your cult. That's a hard thing to recover from. So all systems are broken out of the whole. And most systems are broken because every system is innately imperfect. And typically there's tension. Anytime a system is created, it leaves a remainder. You can see this system over here is a remainder, right? And here, remainder. These are the bits that don't fit in what? They fit in reality. They just don't fit in your system. These forms of energy are the remainder. There is a remainder of energy in every single system that exists. Language is a system. It creates a leftover, a remainder. You divide the circle in by 6 or 5 or 200 million, and you get a remainder. You get a bit that's what? Outside the system, an outlaw. That is created by the system. The outlaw doesn't exist until the system draws a line and says, over here is an outlaw, and over here, you're golden. The system creates the outlaw, number one, and then goes to battle, number two, with its own creation, number three, the outlaw, which leads to rebellion of what? The system that was broken to begin with. The outlaw's job is to fight and destroy the system that is excluding the outlaw from it. because a true system does not exclude any of an interconnected ecology's parts. A true system does not say, we'll get rid of the liver, you're an outlaw. But a human system does exactly that. The human system says, well, screw the oceans. I'm a fisherman. Screw the ocean. I'm a cruise company. I've got to dump my garbage out at sea because if I have to pay to dump that, people are too cheap to buy my cruises. So screw the ocean. But an ecology doesn't think that way. Someone lost in a dogmatic system thinks that way. All systems are broken out of the whole. All systems are broken in that they lead to an inaccurate, simplistic model of reality that creates and sustains unnecessary suffering. And then some systems are broken in their process of doing that, which is, they start going around and then they just don't move. The last bit is missing. So the energy just goes into a void and they start all over again and don't go anywhere. This is the kind of thing of someone getting almost close to achieve something and then and their system doesn't work because their system involves dreaming it, preparing for it, spending money on things, and then giving up on it. So they just do that again and again and again. That's their system for creating things. So they have rooms piling up with half-finished things, and they never finish anything because their system doesn't involve actually closing the sale, finishing it. It just involves all the preparation and abandonment. And so you have the system broken out of the system. You have the system that's broken, that it's creating unnecessary suffering, and then you have that's broken because one of its pieces are missing. And so those are the most inefficient systems of all. But this is the human state. This is human consciousness. We are all living in multiple systems that are broken at multiple different levels. They're broken out of the circle so that we can relate to them with human consciousness. They're broken in their asymmetries and vast amounts of unnecessary suffering. And then finally, in many cases, they're broken because we say this is the system, but we don't actually follow the system. We do this other thing, and so it doesn't work. We put a Volkswagen, carburetor on a Porsche motor, and it doesn't carburate. It doesn't do the thing because we're not even following the system that was broken to begin with. So what a thing to look forward to in transcendent death, in the movement into the transcendent brain. What a thing to look forward to let go of language, to die to the system, to the cult, and find what? Our self. Find what? Our ecology. Find what? Our interconnected one. And appreciate it all the more, having done our best for 80 to 100 years to make sense of it through the lens of our broken words. To let that dissolve in death and return to the Great Mother, to return to the One. And see it in all of its beauty that cannot be captured in language, in its ineffability. And that is the return to the garden. Hi, I'm Dane Rose. All knowledge begins with a paradigm, and out of that paradigm comes an idea, an awareness that we adopt, reject, or synthesize into something better. It doesn't become wisdom, it doesn't become useful until we take action, until we integrate it into not only our thoughts, but our feelings, our body, our words, and our way of being. For that to occur, we have to move from the passive media paradigm into more active engagement. In the link below, in the More Information section, is an invitation to join a very small, deliberately filtered, high-quality discussion with a group of people who share a common language and want to work with these ideas with me and with one another, with the sole goal of creating 10 times more sustainable well-being for ourselves and those around us per unit of energy invested. Thank you for watching.